I never thought I could lose her, yet here she is, choosing another, and I am powerless to stop it. Rejection arrived like a verdict already decided, spoken with courtesy so polished it cut more deeply than cruelty ever could. The Duke of Ravenshollow declined Miss Eliza Hartwell's quiet hope for the third time, and in doing so confirmed what every whisper in London had begun to suspect, that affection, when offered without title or fortune, was a liability he would not risk. Eliza heard the words as one hears thunder behind a closed door, distant yet final, and felt something within her give way not with drama, but with a weary acceptance that tasted of grief. She had not come seeking declarations or vows. She had come, as she always did, with restraint learned from years of observing the rules that governed women without banners beside their names. Her father's education had given her wit and learning, but society had taught her silence, and so she received the Duke's refusal with a bow of the head and a composed reply that thanked him for his honesty. It was only when she was alone, dignity intact and heart unguarded, that the full measure of the rejection pressed upon her chest. Ravenshollow had been careful, as he always was. His words were chosen with the same precision he brought to matters of estate and parliament, and he spoke of duty, alliances, and the expectations attached to his name. He did not speak of her. That omission was the wound. Eliza understood, in that moment, that she had been weighed not against other women, but against ledgers, lineage, and the silent gaze of generations who would never forgive him for marrying beneath his rank. He told himself that firmness was kindness. He believed that allowing hope to linger would be crueler than extinguishing it altogether. Yet as Eliza thanked him and prepared to leave, something faltered within him, a hesitation he masked with formality. He noticed the steadiness of her voice, the care with which she guarded her composure, and felt an unease he refused to name. Regret, he told himself, was a luxury for men who did not bear responsibility. Eliza stepped back into a world that seemed suddenly eager to remind her of her place. Invitations cooled. Conversations shifted when she entered a room. Sympathy arrived cloaked as concern, and concern carried the sharp edge of judgment. She had loved a duke without permission, and society was determined she would pay for such presumption. Yet even as shame brushed against her, she refused to despise herself for having hoped. Her affection for Ravenshollow had never been reckless. It had grown in quiet exchanges, in letters discussing books and the state of the nation, in moments where he had allowed himself to forget the armor of his title. Those moments now felt like borrowed time, reclaimed by reality. Eliza told herself that memory was not betrayal, and that she would survive the loss of a future she had never been promised. For the Duke, the days that followed were marked by an unfamiliar restlessness. He moved through his obligations with mechanical ease, praised for his discernment and strength of character. Each commendation struck him as undeserved, though he could not have explained why. He had done what was required. He had preserved the dignity of his house. Still, a question lingered, unwelcome and persistent, asking whether honor, once stripped of compassion, could truly be called virtue. When word reached him that Eliza had declined further invitations to his circle, he felt a tightening he mistook for irritation. He told himself it was for the best, that distance would ease the awkwardness of an attachment never sanctioned. Yet he found himself recalling her laugh, restrained but sincere, and the way she listened as though his thoughts mattered beyond their usefulness. Such recollections, he resolved, were indulgences he would soon forget. Eliza, meanwhile, made a decision born not of bitterness, but of resolve. She would not remain suspended between longing and propriety, waiting for a man who had already chosen against her. She accepted an invitation beyond the familiar rooms of London society, one that promised neither grandeur nor disgrace, only sincerity. In choosing motion over stagnation, she felt a small, defiant spark of self-respect return. The Duke learned of this change indirectly, through a remark made without intention to wound. Eliza Hartwell, someone said, had been seen in earnest conversation with a naval officer recently returned from service, a man of honor if modest means. The words settled into Ravenshollow's mind with unsettling weight. He told himself it was inconsequential, yet for the first time since he had spoken his refusal, the certainty he prized began to fracture, and he sensed, too late perhaps, that something once dismissed had begun to slip beyond his control. He could not have said when his confidence first betrayed him, only that silence now answered where certainty once stood. Duty remained, stern and unyielding, but it no longer spoke alone. Beneath it stirred a quieter reckoning, asking whether obedience to expectation absolved the harm left in its wake. Eliza's absence, once convenient, now felt deliberate, as though she had chosen herself over the endless patience society demanded of women. That choice unsettled him. It suggested a world in which his refusal was not a final authority, but merely a moment already passing into consequence. For Eliza, the knowledge that her name had reached him again carried no triumph. It brought instead a sober calm, the kind earned when illusions are laid aside. She did not know whether Ravenshollow would ever question his decision, nor did she allow herself to care. Yet on the evening she sealed her reply to the officer's letter, her hand paused, and she acknowledged, without shame, that love does not vanish simply because it is unreturned. It changes, hardens perhaps, and waits to see what the heart will choose next. Tomorrow, the course set in silence would demand answers, and neither pride nor patience would be sufficient shields anymore for either soul. Tragedy does not always arrive with loss, sometimes it announces itself as opportunity offered too late, and that was how the Duke of Ravenshollow learned of the token he had left behind. He had intended it as a courtesy, a final gentleness to soften refusal, never imagining it would become evidence of a hope he pretended not to inspire. When Eliza Hartwell returned the small volume he had once pressed into her hands, unopened and without explanation, the quietness of the gesture struck him harder than any accusation. He told himself that restraint was still the wiser path. Society had begun to murmur, and murmurs were dangerous things, capable of eroding reputation with patient persistence. His mother spoke of eligible alliances. His advisers reminded him of obligations waiting to be fulfilled. Each voice reinforced the logic he had rehearsed, yet the return of that book lingered in his thoughts like a question unanswered. Courtesy, he realized uneasily, could wound as surely as indifference. Eliza's resolve was tested daily by the consequences of having once hoped openly. She encountered sympathy that asked for explanations she refused to give. She endured invitations framed as charity rather than friendship. Yet beneath the strain there stirred a steadiness she had not known before, a quiet assurance born of choosing herself after long restraint. Captain Whitcomb's letters arrived without presumption, offering conversation instead of expectation, and she found relief in the simplicity of being regarded without calculation. Ravenshollow observed these changes from a distance he pretended was intentional. He noticed how her name was spoken now with a different inflection, less speculative, more settled. The knowledge unsettled him. He had believed distance would dissolve attachment, yet absence only clarified what presence had obscured. Still, he held fast to decorum, convincing himself that interference would be unseemly, that any attempt to reclaim what he had refused would expose both of them to ridicule. The token returned to him became a symbol he could not dismiss. He opened the book at last and found his own inscription, written months earlier with careless confidence. The words seemed to belong to another man, one unburdened by consequence. For the first time, he wondered whether his caution had been less noble than he claimed, a shield against vulnerability disguised as duty. The thought disturbed him, for it suggested that fear, not honor, had guided his hand. Eliza accepted Whitcomb's company with growing ease. He spoke plainly, listened attentively, and made no attempt to hurry her feelings. In his steadiness she sensed respect, and in that respect, safety. Yet when she thought of Ravenshollow, it was not bitterness that surfaced but a lingering sadness, tempered by the knowledge that she had survived his refusal without surrendering her worth. That survival felt like a quiet victory, though it carried no celebration. Rumor, however, is rarely content to remain quiet. Whispers reached Ravenshollow that Eliza's regard for the naval officer had deepened, that her future might soon be settled beyond his influence. Each mention tightened something within him, an ache he could no longer dismiss as mere curiosity. He realized, with a disquieting clarity, that he had expected her to wait indefinitely, preserved in uncertainty for his convenience. The recognition unsettled his sense of himself. Duty demanded he remain silent. Pride insisted he should not contest a happiness he had declined to offer. Yet conscience, newly awakened, pressed him toward acknowledgement. He composed a letter he did not send, then another, each abandoned for fear of impropriety. In the end, it was not courage that restrained him, but the dawning awareness that words, once delayed, lose their power to heal. Eliza sensed the shift before it was confirmed. Whitcomb spoke of intentions with careful respect, making space for her consent rather than assuming it. She felt the weight of choice settle upon her, heavier than expectation, lighter than longing. In accepting that weight, she recognized how far she had traveled from the woman who once waited in silence for another's decision. The transformation startled her, and strengthened her resolve. When Ravenshollow finally heard that an understanding had been reached, not yet announced but quietly assured, the news struck with the force of irrevocability. He understood then that restraint had cost him more than scandal ever could have. What he had guarded so fiercely now offered no comfort, only the hollow echo of a life arranged without the one voice that had once challenged his certainty. In that moment, tragedy revealed itself fully, not as loss endured, but as choice made and time surrendered, leaving him poised at the edge of an action he had delayed too long. He did not yet know what form that action would take, only that in allowing events to proceed unchecked, he had granted fate an authority he had long denied to feeling. Eliza, for her part, sealed her reply to Whitcomb with a hand that no longer trembled. She sensed that commitment need not erase the past, only place it where it could no longer command her future. As the words left her pen, she acknowledged, without bitterness, that love once refused becomes a lesson rather than a wound, shaping the heart toward braver choices. Somewhere between his silence and her resolve, an unspoken truth waited, patient and unyielding, poised to demand reckoning. When next they would meet, neither courtesy nor caution would suffice, for the space between them had narrowed into a single question, and its answer would decide whether regret would remain his companion, or yield at last to courage, testing the cost of speaking when silence has already taken so much, and whether time, once surrendered, might yet be claimed, though the claiming would demand everything he had been taught to withhold. That reckoning would arrive soon, carried not by scandal or spectacle, but by a choice finally spoken, one that would alter them both, proving whether restraint had preserved honor, or merely delayed truth, and whether love, once denied, could still transform destiny. Tragedy announced itself as confession withheld, and the silence between them became heavier than any spoken refusal. When Eliza Hartwell agreed to meet the Duke of Ravenshollow privately, she did so not in hope, but in necessity. Waiting had exhausted her, and clarity, however painful, now felt like mercy. For the Duke, the summons arrived as a reckoning he had postponed until delay itself became an accusation. He entered the meeting with composure intact and conviction rehearsed, yet something within him faltered at the certainty of finality. Eliza spoke first, not to accuse, but to release them both from pretense. Her voice carried neither reproach nor plea, only a measured resolve that unsettled him more than anger could have. She told him she had accepted Captain Whitcomb's proposal in principle, though the final word had not yet been given. The admission landed between them with a weight that stripped the room of artifice. For a moment, Ravenshollow forgot the careful language of rank and spoke as a man startled by loss. He confessed that affection had never been absent, only restrained, governed by fear disguised as responsibility. The honesty arrived too late to soothe, yet too early to be dismissed. Eliza listened without interruption, her composure steady though each word confirmed what she had already learned alone. She answered with grace sharpened by truth, telling him that love unchosen becomes a burden rather than a blessing. If he had wished to claim her, he said, he would have done so earlier. The words were spoken calmly, but they left him exposed in their simplicity. Ravenshollow attempted justification, speaking of lineage, expectation, and the weight of inheritance. Even as he spoke, the arguments rang hollow to his own ears. Eliza did not dispute them, instead, she accepted their truth and rejected their priority. She explained that dignity required choice, and that she would not barter her future for the comfort of his uncertainty. Captain Whitcomb, she said, offered no grand estate, but he offered presence. The simplicity of the comparison struck Ravenshollow with humiliating force. He realized then that his power had always allowed him delay, while her position demanded decision. This imbalance, once invisible, now stood plainly between them. Silence followed, thick with what could no longer be unsaid. Ravenshollow, stripped of rehearsed certainty, asked whether any space remained for reconsideration. Eliza did not answer immediately, allowing the pause to speak for her. When she did speak, she told him that reconsideration required courage before consequence, not after. She would not undo her progress simply to soothe his awakening conscience. The clarity of her refusal differed from his own, it carried no fear. In that difference lay the measure of their growth. As they parted, neither bowed to convention, yet both honored it by restraint. Ravenshollow understood that he had crossed an unseen threshold. He could no longer pretend ignorance of what his silence had cost. Eliza left the meeting lighter, though the future before her remained uncertain. She had spoken her truth without surrendering compassion. That knowledge steadied her as she returned to a path chosen by intention rather than hope. For Ravenshollow, intention now arrived accompanied by urgency. He recognized that confession, once delayed, demanded action to give it meaning. Whether that action would be welcomed or rejected no longer altered its necessity. As Eliza's decision approached finality, he stood at the precipice of his own. The tragedy was no longer what had been withheld, but what must now be risked. In the space between restraint and resolve, both had changed irrevocably. When next they would meet, words would not suffice without proof. The choice Eliza was poised to confirm would either seal the Duke's regret, or test whether courage could yet outrun consequence. She sensed that love, once examined honestly, asks not for promises, but for alignment of action and intent. Whitcomb awaited her answer with patience that felt like respect rather than pressure. That patience contrasted sharply with the years she had spent waiting without assurance. Ravenshollow, alone with consequence, understood that delay had taught her how to choose another life. This understanding cut deeper than rejection, because it could not be appealed. He drafted words meant to bridge the distance, then discarded them, knowing bridges require foundation, not sentiment. What he must offer now was not explanation, but transformation. Eliza prepared herself for the final conversation with Whitcomb, aware that endings deserve honesty unsoftened by fear. She would not accept certainty purchased at the cost of integrity. Between these parallel resolves, the future tightened its grip. The Duke knew that any attempt to remain silent now would be an act of self-betrayal. He also knew that speaking would invite judgment he had long avoided. Courage, he finally understood, was not the absence of risk, but the acceptance of rightful consequence. As Eliza folded Whitcomb's letter, she felt the gravity of being chosen by herself. The act steadied her more than any promise ever had. Somewhere beyond her knowledge, Ravenshollow made a decision that would either redeem his silence or condemn it forever. The tragedy that opened between them now narrowed into a single moment approaching. It would demand words matched by deed, humility matched by risk. Until that moment arrived, both carried the weight of what they were about to choose. The next step, once taken, would not allow retreat. In that certainty lay fear, and also the first true promise either had known. Eliza lifted her pen, aware that the stroke would shape her life beyond speculation. Ravenshollow, elsewhere, reached for courage without certainty of forgiveness. The space between them held its breath, waiting for action to replace intention. What followed would decide whether restraint had merely delayed truth, or whether truth, once faced, could still alter destiny. The answer stood imminent, balanced between her resolve and his resolve, and neither would emerge unchanged. Silence broke inwardly first, promising that the next choice would finally be heard. Everything waited on courage alone, now, utterly. Tragedy arrived not as loss, but as resolve hardened into motion, and Ravenshollow understood that hesitation had reached its end. He did not seek counsel, nor did he cloak his intent in diplomacy, for once delay had cost him more than action ever could. The decision he made was not born of confidence, but of necessity, sharpened by the knowledge that silence would now define him more cruelly than scandal. He chose to speak, and in choosing it, accepted whatever judgment would follow. His message to Eliza was neither ornate nor pleading. It carried no defense of his past, only acknowledgment of it, and a request for the one thing he had never before granted her freely, choice without shadow. He asked for a final meeting, not to persuade, but to declare himself honestly, knowing that honesty offered no guarantee of redemption. The act itself marked a change he could not undo. Eliza received the request with composure that surprised even her. The old ache stirred briefly, then settled into clarity. She understood that courage delayed does not erase its cost, yet she also recognized that transformation, when genuine, deserves witness. She agreed to hear him, not because she owed him anything, but because she trusted her own steadiness now. She would listen without surrender. When they met, restraint governed their exchange, yet something unmistakably altered the space between them. Ravenshollow spoke without the armor of rank, acknowledging that he had mistaken caution for virtue and fear for wisdom. He admitted that in guarding his inheritance, he had neglected the humanity entrusted to him. The confession was unadorned, and therefore dangerous, for it offered no shelter in rhetoric. Eliza did not soften her response to spare him. She told him that his awakening arrived at the edge of her departure, and that timing, once ignored, becomes consequence. Yet she also told him that she saw the change he described, not as promise, but as effort finally begun. Effort, she reminded him, is not love, but it is its necessary proof. Her words neither condemned nor absolved him, leaving the weight of meaning where it belonged. Ravenshollow then did what he had never allowed himself before. He relinquished outcome. He told her that he would not ask her to choose him over another, nor demand time she had already given too freely. He asked only that she judge him by what he was willing to risk now, not by what he had once preserved. In that surrender lay the truest declaration he could offer. Eliza felt the balance shift, subtle yet decisive. She recognized that this was not the man who had refused her with courtesy, but one willing to stand without guarantee. Still, she did not forget the life she had begun to build beyond him. Captain Whitcomb's regard had been steady, unmarred by hesitation, and she would not dismiss that devotion lightly. Choice, once claimed, must be exercised with integrity. She told Ravenshollow that love could not be summoned by confession alone, nor erased by past denial. It required alignment between word and future. She would not withdraw from her engagement without certainty that courage would not again yield to convenience. Her answer was not refusal, but condition, and in setting it she affirmed her own authority. Ravenshollow accepted this boundary without protest. In doing so, he acknowledged that change demands patience he had never before offered. He understood that this was the cost of delay, and he did not resist it. The acceptance itself marked another departure from the man he had been. Where once he had controlled circumstance, he now submitted to it. Eliza left the meeting aware that something within her had shifted as well. She no longer measured herself by his regard, nor defined her future by avoidance of pain. She had met his truth without losing her own. That realization steadied her as she prepared for the final conversation that awaited her elsewhere. For Ravenshollow, the aftermath carried no relief, only resolve. He knew that declaration without endurance was hollow. If he wished to be worthy of reconsideration, he would need to live the courage he had finally spoken. Reputation, inheritance, and expectation would test that resolve relentlessly. He accepted the trial without illusion. Eliza approached Whitcomb with honesty shaped by respect. She told him of the confession she had heard, not to provoke jealousy, but to honor the trust he had extended her. She spoke of uncertainty not as weakness, but as responsibility. Whitcomb listened, as he always had, and in his silence offered her the space to choose freely. That silence became the measure by which all others were judged. Eliza realized that love expressed through patience carries a different gravity than love declared through risk. Both demanded courage, but of different kinds. The choice before her was no longer between men, but between futures shaped by distinct values. Ravenshollow waited without entitlement, aware that waiting was now his burden to bear. He had relinquished the privilege of expectation, and in doing so discovered humility long absent from his character. Whether that humility would be rewarded remained unknown. He did not attempt to predict the outcome, only to remain equal to whatever came. As Eliza weighed her decision, she acknowledged that happiness is not granted by sacrifice alone, nor secured by safety alone. It emerges when respect, courage, and constancy converge. The knowledge clarified her heart without simplifying the path ahead. She understood that either choice would demand loss, and that loss accepted willingly becomes transformation rather than regret. The distance between decision and declaration narrowed, heavy with consequence. Ravenshollow stood prepared to accept finality, whatever form it took. Eliza prepared to speak words that would shape more than her own fate. Between them lay the possibility that courage, once delayed, might yet arrive in time. The next answer would decide whether that possibility would endure, or dissolve into the permanence of having almost chosen, and the reckoning waited, silent but relentless. Boom, the bitter wind tore through the Ravenshollow estate grounds, rattling the shutters as if the very house protested the emptiness that now clung to its halls. The Duke of Ravenshollow, once so commanding in presence, now found himself a solitary figure on the terrace, his coat flaring behind him as he pressed both hands to the cold stone balustrade. Autumn had stripped the trees bare, and with their naked limbs swinging in the gust, he felt the raw exposure of his own heart. Seasons had passed since the quiet girl he had repeatedly dismissed, Miss Eliza Hartwell, had taken another man's arm, and yet each day, each fleeting shadow on the wind, reminded him that what he had spurned was no ordinary affection, but something rare, untainted by ambition or social calculus. Inside, the mansion's warmth seemed almost cruel, the crackle of the fireplace, the polished wood reflecting golden light, all a theater of comfort he could no longer enjoy. Every room whispered Eliza's absence, every familiar corner held a memory of her soft laughter echoing, a glance shared that had never been requited. The Duke had prided himself on duty, on restraint, on the inexorable pull of lineage and expectation, yet now, in the hollow quiet, he understood the depth of his folly. In choosing security and propriety over sentiment, he had invited a torment no title or estate could alleviate. Even the family portraits, frozen faces of ancestors, seemed to regard him with the unspoken judgment of eternity. His mind, usually regimented, was now a battlefield of recollections, her first hesitant curtsy at the winter ball, the warmth in her eyes as she discussed literature, her subtle, earnest gestures that spoke of a patience and faith he had never matched. And then, the scandal that had never actually scandalized, yet had terrified him with its simplicity, the very sight of her engagement to a modest naval officer. A man of sense and honesty, yet unpolished, unconnected to the grandeur of Ravenshollow. The Duke had seen the announcement, stiff and formal, and had felt a jolt of disbelief followed by a strange, hollow relief, the acknowledgement that she had chosen life and companionship over waiting endlessly for a heart he had failed to offer. The duel between pride and regret was relentless, and in the quiet hours of the night, it left him gasping for a past that could never return. And yet, it was not bitterness alone that gripped him. There was an undeniable tenderness, a swelling ache that reminded him of the vitality of living emotions. He recalled the last evening he had spoken to her, words carefully measured, restrained by duty, yet charged with an unspoken longing. "I cannot," he had said, voice low, yet steady, as though the declaration itself could shield him from the ruin of desire. She had smiled then, that gentle, enduring smile, and bowed her head with grace that made him wish, violently, that the world would allow a single rebellion against the rigid lines he had drawn around himself. That evening had passed, and her departure had left a silence so profound that even the estate seemed diminished, hollowed, as though Ravenshollow itself mourned the absence of the light she carried. The news of her engagement had reached him like a cannon shot in the dead of night, swift and unyielding. He had felt the walls of his restraint crumble, a terrible clarity settling over him. Eliza had found solace, and in doing so, had rendered his own ambitions meaningless. And yet, as much as despair threatened, a stubborn flicker of hope remained. Could he, should he, attempt to reclaim what he had cast aside? But society's scrutiny, the imperatives of decorum, and the indelible mark of time stood as silent sentinels against any impulsive return. The man he had once been, he realized, could not simply demand the love he had rejected. He would have to earn it, with humility and truth. And humility, he now understood, was far more daunting than any duel or political negotiation. A soft rustle at the terrace door made him glance up. The wind carried with it a sound of movement, footsteps? Could it be an intruder, or merely the house asserting its creaks and groans? The Duke's hand tightened around the balustrade, knuckles white, as a familiar voice, hesitant yet steady, broke the chill. Duke Ravenshollow? The single utterance of his name, soft and measured, sent a shiver through him. His chest tightened, mind racing with memories that refused to be contained. He had long since convinced himself that he had done all that could be done, that her life was now a private affair from which he must remain apart. Yet here she was, or was it only his imagination, conjured from the relentless ache of longing and regret? He stepped forward, heart hammering against the confines of his stern composure. "Miss Hartwell," he said, voice a careful balance of decorum and barely restrained emotion. The name lingered between them like a fragile glass, trembling with unspoken possibilities. She stood on the threshold, eyes bright but calm, a measure of composure he could scarcely comprehend. The years had softened her, yet strengthened her too. She was at once familiar and transformed, carrying the grace of experience and the dignity of one who had made choices with a clarity he had often lacked. The distance between them was no longer merely spatial. It was the expanse of time, of opportunities foregone, of whispered regrets. And yet, even as he surveyed the elegance of her posture, the quiet determination in her gaze, He sensed a door opening, a slender, hesitant portal through which something precious might still pass. The thought made him tremble, for it was hope, fragile and insistent, in its most vulnerable form. She had chosen, she had moved forward, yet the very act of her presence suggested that life, and perhaps forgiveness, were not beyond reach. The first words that bridged the space between them were careful, formal, yet imbued with the subtle weight of feeling. "It has been many seasons, Your Grace," she said, her voice even, but with a resonance that hinted at memory, at unspoken trials endured. He nodded, a gesture stiff but reverent, for he understood now that every moment he had denied her, every rigid restraint, had led to this singular, charged reunion. "Indeed, Miss Hartwell," he murmured, the words almost lost to the wind, yet carrying a gravity he had never permitted in his youthful pride. The air seemed to hold its breath, and in that pause, both of them were acutely aware of the distance they had traveled, the choices they had made, and the possibility of a bridge forming from the remnants of regret and affection. She inclined her head, a motion that seemed at once courteous and defiant, acknowledging the gulf between them while hinting at an unexpected intimacy. The wind swirled, rustling the fallen leaves at their feet, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth, a symbol, perhaps, of renewal, of the world's subtle insistence that love, even delayed, might endure. The Duke felt a stirring in his chest, a tension between the rigid expectations of title and the unruly force of his heart. For the first time, he saw not the constraints, the alliances, the duty, but the woman herself, brilliant, steadfast, irreducible. He realized that no estate, no alliance, no social triumph could match the quiet gravity of a heart that had waited for him, even as he had turned